Hello, and welcome to Story Structure Lessons from the Discworld. This is part 3 of our series. In the previous parts, we brought up the idea of a story arc as being kind of a one-dimensional story where we only care about one thing. Something that we care about, the body of the arc is that we engage with that thing, and finally we bring it to some kind of resolution, and that gives us a story arc. Then we brought up mice. We introduced this approach, which basically gives us a few different focuses. If each story arc is one thing that we care about, mice gives us some really strong, solid, common examples of what it might be that we care about and in what way. A milieu arc, we are there in order to tour a fascinating setting. In an idea arc, we care about finding the answer to a question. In a character arc, we care about a character's development. We want to see them change or evolve. And in an event arc, there is some kind of problem or threat in the world, and we want to see it fixed. Those are 4 ideas of what we might care about in a story arc. Today, we're going to take the terminology that we've got so far, the story arcs and mice, and we're going to talk about how we use them practically in order to look at a story and saying, hey, something here is not working well. Something here is not built with a solid structure. Something here is not consistent about what kind of story it actually is. We're going to see how this terminology is actually really helpful in order to figure out problems that we see. And after that, we're going to continue and see how we can use mice and its particular focus on what it is that we care about in order to see what steps we're expecting those arcs to have and see that we actually have them. So we're going to start with some, I call them diseases, micey diseases, that we're going to use the idea of story arcs and mice in order to say, okay, here's what the problem is. One that's very common is the story that just doesn't start. You wait and you wait, and it may well be that things are happening, but you just don't feel like the story has actually started. What's actually missing is this section of the arc is just missing. We might be engaging with stuff, but we've never established something that we actually care about. And that's usually a problem with establishing what it is that the reader or audience is supposed to care about. Or sometimes the story might not know well enough what it is that it wants people to care about, so it can't possibly establish that thing. The effect that this tends to cause is that you don't get an arc. You get like a bunch of starts, like here's something starting and here's something else that's starting and here's something else, and that continuation, what is that, what does that connect to? Why is that meant to be important to me? And wait, something else is starting, something else is concluding, and it all just feels like a kind of mess. You're not following what is supposed to be important. Let's give an example. It's kind of hard to find very popular stories that also feel like, why am I even here? Why should I be reading this? I don't care about this. Books that start out like that tend to not do very well. But let's give a pretty good one. Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. This is the 4th Harry Potter book. Once the series was also was already very popular, and it starts with, I don't know, easily 150 pages of Harry Potter and his friends go to a Quidditch game. It's an international Quidditch game. They get to watch other people playing Quidditch. Yeah, it's a really dull beginning. There's a lot going on. And as you progress through the story, you actually find out that everything that happened there and all the characters and everything there actually turn out to be really important and have a lot of significance to the story. But while you are reading it, you're just, why aren't we going to Hogwarts? What? Why are we reading all of this? I don't care. And that's exactly this problem. The failure to establish of why it is that we should care, what it is that we should be caring about. This whole Quidditch sequence, it sets up stuff for later, but while you're reading it, you don't know that. You don't know that it's setting stuff up for later. It feels like it's not part of any arc. So even though you've got characters that you love, an interesting setting, lots of stuff going on, the story feels like it hasn't started. Let's look at another one. Somebody else's ending. In general, again, an arc starts with something we care about and goes to some kind of resolution. But what you'll see in a lot of stories are that those two don't actually match. A lot of times it's like, oh wow, this kingdom sure is in trouble because everybody hates each other, but we found the magic amulet that brings down the power of the gods. Yay! Okay, but does that help the kingdom? If there's a character who nobody likes because he never seems to do anything right, and then one day a dragon threatens the town, and he goes and he beats the dragon. Okay, but does that actually make his life better? Isn't he still this guy who keeps doing everything wrong? What happens is you're kind of progressing naturally along this sense of, well, what's the next problem? What happens next? And you go from the initial thing that we care about to some kind of conflict. And then when you finish that kind of conflict, you're like, oh, I finished that. That is a resolution to this story. That's an ending, and therefore this story is done. But if you've had a switcheroo there in the middle, if you switch from one thing that the reader cares about to kind of a tangent, and you've solved that tangent, that can feel super unsatisfying. And, the reader might not even notice. They'll also feel, well, that was an ending, but it's not what I was looking for. Why is that? That was definitely an ending, but it wasn't the ending of the right thing. Here's where my Game of Thrones spoiler is going to come in. This is exactly what happened at the end of the Game of Thrones. The Game of Thrones, when it started out at the very beginning, what did you care about? It was this sense of constant tension and palace intrigue and political maneuvering. So much of the focus of the series was, wow, it's so important who holds power, and anybody holding power has huge influence over everybody. But how can noble people maintain power if everybody wants it? If so many people are willing to be so ruthless about getting power? So how can good people who care about the general population, how can they defend themselves and maintain power without becoming ruthless villains themselves? It was really interesting and intense, and it's this constant tension that spoke to readers and to viewers. We will note that the ending is not that. It was kind of a sudden Deus Ex Machina where it's like, okay, actually, we're just going to blow up everything. Does it actually in any way speak with noble people trying to maintain power? Not really. It instead wound up answering a very, very different question. A question like, hey, who's going to win at the end of all this? That's also a lot of what the promotional material was like. It's like, who will sit on the Iron Throne at the end? But if you think about those questions are maybe idea questions, asking questions about our society, or maybe milieu questions, asking how the world works. And the ending, if the ending is like, well, we got a new status quo, that event ending just doesn't satisfy anything of why we were in this series to begin with. I think this is also a really interesting example because the Game of Thrones series is, of course, based on these Song of Ice and Fire books by George R.R. Martin. And a lot of people say, quite reasonably, well, George R.R. Martin is he's the good writer. Very possible that this is exactly the ending that Martin is actually working towards if he ever finishes this series. He might very well write this exact ending, but when he does it, it's going to be good. And I agree with this point. if Martin reaches this ending, he very well might do the same ending, and it might be wonderful and satisfying in all the ways that the series wasn't. It can have the exact same events, but if you cast those events and portray them in a way that actually speaks to all of those things that we actually care about, if we have the same devastating ending, but here it will speak to the attempt for noble people to maintain power, that is entirely possible with exactly the same events. It's not a question of what the plot is, it's a question about what the reader cares about and how well that is satisfied. Okay, so here's one that I call the Promised Land story. Here, there's no problem with establishing what it is that the reader cares about. In fact, we make them a fantastic promise. We promise that their resolution is going to be something amazing. We are going to discover the answer to a mind-boggling mystery. We are going to discover Atlantis. We are going to have a showdown with the horrible villain, anything, okay? The ending is going to be phenomenal. But what happens until then? In the middle, it might well not reach that point yet and not engage with those things that we care about. It's kind of like a journey of eventually we will go back to the story. This middle part of the arc is just missing, dealing with other stuff, going on side tracks and going into other plot arcs, but completely missing out on anything that would actually build up to the resolution and feel like it's actually engaging with the thing that we care about. And this can lead to a hugely unsatisfying story. Who wants to read a 300-page murder mystery where you absolutely find out the murderer on page 290, but all the pages before that are just wandering around going, boy, I wonder who murdered this guy? That would be really, really dull. And yet we see it all the time. Kind of the substitution of any conflict is enough to bridge us over until we can actually get to that very awesome ending. I'm going to give an example here from Pixar's movie Up. Up has the most fantastic first 10-minute opening sequence. It's an absolute masterpiece. It absolutely stands on its own. Watch that. Definitely watch that part of it if you haven't. It has this very touching, lovable character in this very warm and human and touching situation. And it finally leads to him escaping from the world by having all these balloons in his house, and his house lifts up and he leaves the whole city behind him. It is marvelous. It's absolutely wonderful. It's also only the first 10 minutes, because after that, the balloons take the house to Peru, to this place, and they have like this mission, and we have like an hour of these random sidekicks walking around having slapstick and adventures, and not that much is happening. And I mean, it's not that nothing is happening, lots is happening, but none of it really relates to that beginning, to the character that we have established as being the heart, as being what the story is about. There's just not much of him, and what there is doesn't really engage any further than that fantastic opening sequence already did. Now, again, I think this is a really interesting example because Pixar know how to make and write movies. There is an ending to this story that absolutely calls back to the beginning. It's a fantastic ending. I literally teared up as I was getting screenshots for this presentation. I saw the ones at the ending. I'm like, oh. And it's also very easy to say why the whole middle sequence, all the adventures, were pretty necessary in order to reach that ending. You kind of needed them there. And yet, despite all that, The middle of the story arc isn't there. There is a fantastic beginning, an excellent ending, and nothing in the middle. Okay, so that's how some arcs can look that just don't, that miss important elements. Here is where Mice does so much fantastic work, because Mice has given us prototypes, ideas of what a story might care about. And taking it one step further, using Mice can really help you look at any particular story arc and say, this is an idea story. So here's what I expect an idea story to have. Here's the stops I expect along the way. Here are the parts I want to have in this arc, because otherwise it's going to feel unsatisfying and its structure will not feel solid. So again, here's our story arc, something that we care about, we engage with it, and finally we resolve it. The moment that we say what it is that we care about, from among the 4 very broad Mice archetypes, we can say a lot of what each of those sections might look like. Let's talk about milieu arcs. We've given the example in the Discworld of the Rincewind stories, where very often Rincewind is dragged off on some new misadventure and he spends it running away from everything there. What do we expect a milieu story to look like? Okay, let's see, what do we care about and how do we establish that we care about it? So story starts with embarking on a journey. There is a journey to be taken. In the Rincewind stories, he's like, oh, well, I'm stuck in this new place and I need to survive it. But another part that's no less important is kind of defining what the journey is going to look like. Telling the reader it is going to be interesting and in what way. For example, there's one Rincewind book where he finds himself forced to fulfill 3 wishes. Right at the beginning of the book, Eric the Sorcerer tells him, listen, here are my 3 wishes. Right there, you have the structure of the story established. You know that the story is going to do wish number 1, wish number 2, wish number 3. That is how the story is going to look. And you can look forward to those because you've been told what they are up front. Or in another book, in The Last Continent, Rincewind finds himself magically deposited on XXXX, which is a kind of Australia analog, and all of the animals are incredibly deadly. And there's this great little scene where Death is wandering around and he sees Rincewind's he sees Rincewind is stuck over there on this last continent where everything is deadly, and he's very, very curious. And he goes to the library and he says, give me a list of all the deadly creatures on this continent. And he gets bookshelves falling down on him. And you're like, well, maybe tell me just the non-deadly creatures. And gets a little note like some of the sheep. What is that doing? That is telling us what journey we're about to go on. When you see something like that, you're like, I see what this book is going to be like. I am looking for this character to hit these stops and for this to be the kind of scenery. So that is how you establish that we are going on a journey, that we're going on a milieu arc. Where does a milieu arc end? It ends when the journey does. Every journey reaches an end. Maybe, a lot of times the person finishes the journey and goes back home. With Rincewind, very often, he ends the journey by finally making it through everything and then being shunted somewhere else horrible, which will be described in the next book. It doesn't matter. The only important thing is that you say, okay, this journey is finished. We have seen all the sights here that we're going to see. What is in the middle? The stops along the way. We are tourists. We are sightseers. We're not building up a plot or a story. I mean, we might be, but that would be a different arc. In a milieu story, we are stopping and seeing the sights. And so engaging with what we care about is every time that we see something new and interesting and exciting and colorful, that is how we engage. That is how we see the thing that we care about. Let's do idea arcs. We've said that idea arcs are exemplified by the City Watch books, which are very often mystery stories where somebody has been murdered or somebody is going to be murdered, and the City Watch are investigating and trying to find out who. Where does an idea arc start? It always starts with the posing of a question. That's how you know that you're going into an idea arc. You know what to look forward to. Your curiosity is piqued and you want to know what the answer is. The answer, of course, is what concludes the idea arc. Once your curiosity has been satisfied, the arc is finished. We've also talked about idea arcs, which are less single question and single answer. And so those might end with some kind of closing insight or a general understanding that we have gotten the gestalt of the idea that we have explored, and we understand it well enough. We understand the shape of it, even if there's more that we could conceivably explore. What is in the middle of an idea story? For one thing, we want to constantly be provoking curiosity. Ideally, the reader is curious from the start. And yet, if you say, if what they're curious about and how curious they are just stays the same, that pretty much sounds like you haven't answered anything until the very ending of the story. That feels like that very dull mystery novel where nothing gets answered until the very end. No, you want them constantly curious. Engaging with curiosity means constantly provoking curiosity and also constantly satisfying curiosity, or at least partially. You want to constantly be giving partial answers. You want the reader to feel like they are making progress, like they understand things better than they did before. This is the constant tug and struggle of investigation or of satisfying curiosity. It's not the promise that eventually you will know the answer. It is the investigation, the consideration, the constant mental struggle of understanding more and more and more and more. You want that sense of progress. And another thing that's just really helpful in idea stories is to show fair play. Again, the final answer to the question is only going to be at the end. But if you are throughout the story having smaller instances of questions and answers, of making deductions, of learning interesting things, that gives the reader a lot of trust that you actually will have a good answer at the end, that it won't be some random last minute, oh, well, I got to have an answer, so I'm going to put something in. No, if you show them that you know how questions and answers work, that you're able to pose and solve smaller questions as you go, if you show that you respect logic and investigation or whatever the story is using in order to grapple with the question, if you show that it leads to interesting answers, then the reader will expect and anticipate the answer to the main and most significant question to be just as good and satisfying. Again, I think we see this in the Discworld books really nicely with Vimes in his investigations, who very frequently will stop for a scene and consider the mystery. He'll pause and he'll dwell over what have they found and what are the outstanding questions. What is it that doesn't make sense right now? Sometimes he'll start noticing strange side routes, or he'll notice that other people are getting hurt and not only the immediate victim. These scenes let the reader grapple with the mystery. Not only does it give them information, it lets them feel that sense of we are curious and we're doing something about it and we're finding interesting stuff out. And that is the heart and bones of an idea story. Let's talk about character arcs. Character arcs, we said, are internal conflict, and we see them most in the Discworld series in the Witches books, where we have so many characters who really do change and grow and develop as the series continue. Very often, a character arc will start with an intolerable situation. The character can no longer stand the way that things are, which is both the situation that they are in and also literally who they as a person are. Very often it's the character's breaking point. It's when they say no more. Something needs to change, and that something is me. The story will end when the character reaches a new social role, when their position has changed or who they are has changed. Sometimes instead it will be the acceptance of an old role, either because they've reached new insight and now they like it a lot more than they used to, or it might be because they have despaired of ever making things any better, and that too is character growth. The middle of a story, of a character arc, will want to constantly establish that pain and urgency, all those reasons that things have to change and cannot possibly stay the way that they are. And they want to show the attempts and the efforts, all the times that the character is put in uncomfortable situations and needs to deal with it, or the times when the character tries to extend themselves or do things differently than they always have before, and how that works out. Again, this is the heart of the story. That is seeing the character grapple with themselves and with their situation. So let's take some of the Discworld Witches arcs that are very focused on character. I think one of the fantastic ones is Agnes in the book Masquerade. Agnes is a very large woman who is, in general, very unhappy, unsatisfied in the world. She always seems to be the smartest and calmest person pretty much anywhere, but nobody appreciates her. And she has this alter ego, this kind of ideal self that she would much rather be, who she's called Perdita X, who is mysterious and snarky and not nearly as nice and sensible as Agnes is. So first of all, we see this established right at the beginning, along with Agnes's general situation, which is that she doesn't want to be a witch, but she knows the witches are going to pressure her into being one, and so she wants to go run away and be in the opera instead. What do we see here? We see a character under a ton of tension. We see both who the character is and who she wants to be. We constantly see how ill-fitted and ill-suited she is to the opera, both as herself and with her alter ego. We constantly see how both the opera and the witches are constantly putting pressures on her and making her unhappy and uncomfortable and forcing her into new situations. Some of the time she tries to conform. She tries to make the situation work. And some of the times she does not. And that's how you get a character arc, which is constantly focused on how unhappy the character is, how much they need to change, and how much they try to. Finally, event arcs. Event arcs are all about the disruption of the status quo. And we've talked about how in the Discworld, some of the really interesting event arcs are those with death, where very often the very concept of death stops working. How does an event arc start? How do you establish that people should care about it? Well, first you establish what the threat is. There's always some kind of external problem or danger, something that needs to get fixed. You want to show what it is and why it's interesting, and why seeing people fight it or fix it is going to be a great experience. Very often you also want to show that the heroes are at a breaking point, that the problem has grown so dire that the heroes absolutely must solve it. Where does the story end? It ends when the conflict is resolved. Again, this is external conflict. And when one side has won, it has been resolved. When the heroes have succeeded or succeeded at some things and failed at others, what happens is that you get a new status quo. And that is where the event story ends. It begins when the status quo has been disrupted, and it ends when there is a new status quo, when you know how things are going to be from here on. I think if you go back and you look at some of the death stories from Mort to Hogfather, they end really interestingly, not just with the problem being solved, but they end with death going, well, let us talk about what happens next. You have this kind of denouement where you see not just the immediate victory, but how the characters' lives are going to look going forward. Mort reaches his very particular conclusion. Susan is going to continue in her path. They end not just with winning, but with showing how things are going to be from now on. In a lot of stories, that might just be, hey, there was a danger, now there isn't. The new status quo is exactly the same as what would have been at the very beginning of the story if nothing had happened at all. But in a lot of other stories, it will be very different than that. The new status quo can be entirely different, and the course of events will have changed because of what has happened in the story. What do you have in the middle of the story of an event arc? Well, always you need to establish the interest. So here it's establishing the difficulty and the danger, how big a problem it is that this danger is there, and how impossible and difficult it's going to be in order to solve. Again, you want to see the attempts and efforts. This is all about fixing things, so you need to see the heroes trying to fix it or trying to get strong enough to fix it or whatever it is that will let them ultimately solve the external conflict. And another thing that's really helpful is a kind of map to a solution, which often will be built as you go. Just because if you know that there are good rebels and a bad Death Star, but you see no conceivable way that some random rebels on a sand planet are actually going to manage to defeat the entire empire, well, starting to give a sketch to, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z, or if we only could reach Y, then maybe we could Z, that is what builds up understanding and expectation and gives structure to the event arc so that there is constantly a reason to feel involved, to feel engrossed, to see that the arc has a chance of progressing from this early desperate situation where there seems to be no chance to victory. Nonetheless, the arc needs to manage to get from here to the problem being solved. And so showing that that's actually possible, signaling that there are ways, can help your structure be much stronger than if you just count on the reader going, well, yes, they're just rebels on a sand planet, but they gotta beat the Empire, so I guess by the end they'll probably find something. No, you want to show that the route is actually possible and give at least hints as to what it might be. That's what I've got for this video. Again, I want to thank Paul Kidby, who very kindly allowed me to use his art for this presentation. You can find his work at paulkidby.com. Next will be the conclusion of this series, where I'm going to talk about how mice can be useful to you, whether you are a writer, whether you like discovery writing where you'd have no idea what happens next, or whether you're a very structured writer. I'm going to talk a little bit about how mice can be useful to both of those styles, but also if you're just a reader or a viewer and you just like thinking about stories, mice can be really helpful. We'll talk about that next time. I hope I'll see you then. Thank you very much.